The title then, Philosophy and the Aftermath of Trauma, I chose it because I was originally going to talk about Susan Bryson. I don't know how well Susan Bryson would be known to you. She's a political philosopher working in New England. And in 1990 or thereabouts, she was on holiday in France and was raped and nearly killed. And it went into a court case, the man's in prison, and she spent a long time thinking this through and wrote a book about 10 years after that, I think in 2001, with the title Aftermath. And rather a brilliant cover, I think, with the, what is it, flowers or flames, those yellow marks? Or is it perhaps even suggesting hands pleading, imploring, or in prayer? And she writes that I'm filled with gratitude for the new life I was forced to make, a life that feels less like something following a disastrous event and more like a new growth of grass following one or more mowings, the original meaning of aftermath. I said I'm going to deviate from this topic now, and the reason I want to move away from her book is that I felt uneasy writing about a book that was her own recollection of what had happened to her, her own therapy in a certain sense. And secondly, also, I wanted to turn the attention away from the accounts given by those who've experienced trauma of this kind towards the position and role of witnesses to those who've suffered trauma of this kind. But I do like this quotation which she brings in near the end of the book, and it's something that I'll be referring back to at the end of what I have to say. She explains it as follows: aftermath, something that results or follows from an event, especially one of disastrous or unfortunate nature, and then this secondary meaning, new growth of grass following one or more mowings. And in fact, the English word meadow comes from that same root. And it made me think about, and she indeed writes partly about, the language of philosophy, and not just philosophy, but the language of theorizing and explaining, of setting things in their place, of clear and distinct ideas, which I think sometimes compromises attempts at therapy on the part of the person who suffered and those who try to help her. And it also reflects a little on the ancient quarrel, so-called, between poetry and philosophy, between literature and philosophy, if you like, which I think reverberates through some of the discussions we've already heard today. And a final note there also that's relevant, the tendency in so many fields, literature most obviously, but also anthropology, sociology, and many of the humanities, history and so on, the tendency to rely on a clearly worked out body of theory, which then gives you your method for approaching the object of your study. And that's been criticized in various ways, and I want to contribute to that criticism. I think it's a stifling, that those can be stifling approaches where one thinks one must, first of all, have a methodology. It's a stifling in the study of education too. So the different approach I'm going to adopt involves asking you to look at a few minutes of a film, perhaps about 5 minutes now and 5 minutes at a later stage. And I won't say what the film is, I'd just like you to see this opening sequence, and I hope it comes through satisfactorily as we move on. I'll make some comments afterwards.
Regarde, l'autre vieille une femme là-bas, elle est morte comme ça, hein.
T'es sûr?
Dans le fossé, ah oui, c'est sûr, hein. Ouais, je me dis quoi?
Mais je vais appeler le gendarme.
Là, on devra s'en aller.
Mais une photo du visage. Le visage.
Et une femme, dans le fossé, elle est morte. Elle est morte.
Oui, quelle heure il était quand tu l'as trouvé?
Le matin, à 10 heures, je crois.
10 heures.
Et si elle est tombée, assommée avec le froid qu'il a fait, il a fait moins 2, elle a été saisie par le froid.
Elle n'a pas tapé.
Ah, c'est dans l'idée, sûrement, il a foutu la comporte, hein.
m 50. Elle avait l'air comment? Elle avait l'air un corps?
On peut le buter comme une clocharde. Là, elle m'a regardé de façon. J'ai compris que c'est une clocharde. C'est ce que je peux vous dire.
D'après toi?
C'est une mort naturelle. Hein.
Mort naturelle. Apparemment, pas de trace, pas de. La position du corps, apparemment, elle est morte de froid. Donc.
Personne ne réclamant le corps, il passa du fossé à la fosse commune. Cette morte de mort naturelle ne laissait pas de traces. Je me demande qui pensait encore à elle parmi ceux qui l'avaient connue petite. Mais les gens qu'elle avait rencontrés récemment se souvenaient d'elle. Ces témoins m'ont permis de raconter les dernières semaines de son dernier hiver. Elle les avait impressionnés. Ils parlaient d'elle sans savoir qu'elle était morte. Je n'ai pas cru bon de leur dire, ni qu'elle s'appelait Mona Bergeron. Moi-même, je sais peu de choses d'elle. Mais il me semble qu'elle venait de la mer.
Deux francs, tu peux l'avoir.
Ouais. Mais quand on tombe sur une vraie fille à poil, il se dégonfle. L'autre fois sur la plage, moi j'y serais allé. Une fille seule, on peut y aller, hein.
L'eau doit être gelée. Pour se baigner, il faut être dingue.
Peut-être que la femme parie.
Moi, je le ferai pas. Ou alors pour une brique. Elle est pas mal, hein?
On va aller voir.
Non, pour l'eau. J'ai du boulot.
C'est pas pour nous, là.
Une autre fois, pour l'eau.
C'est plus la saison pour camper. Il n'y a plus personne.
Il y a moi. Ah, c'est moche, c'est mon truc.
L'été, c'est plus vivant. Il y a du monde de partout. On a atteint 90 000, mais l'hiver, on n'est que 3 000.
Ça fait 87 000 lits vides.
Pourquoi? C'est un lit que tu cherches? Si tu veux, il y a la couchette derrière.
Oui, ça va, on change de disque. Il y a la radio?
Non.
Tout le confort, mais pas de radio. Il est nul ton bahut. Même pas de radio.
Bon, allez, je m'arrête ici. Alors tu te démarques.
Tu t'en sors pas gratis, toi, hein? Bon, allez, salut.
Okay, so you see the farm worker walking along, the camera tracks as he walks past a vine, And then he discovers the body. Then you see the police come, and the police take witness statements from those who've been around, those who've seen her recently. And then you see the body being examined by the police. They take things out of her pockets to see if she has papers. She is sans papier. She has no identity with her. And that's illegal in France. And then you see them lifting her into the white plastic bag, it being zipped up, case closed. And then there's the cut to a rather beautiful shot of the ripples on the sand, at which point a voiceover comes in, female voice. And this voice tells you that when the body was discovered, she was curious about the past, she wanted to make a documentary about it, and that's the documentary that you're now going to see. A documentary made up through various witness statements. So who is the voice you just heard? It's the auteur of the documentary that's going to be made. Is it also the auteur of the film? The film is called Vagabond in the English translation. The French sans toit ni loi means without roof or law, or roof or rule. And the French also contains a pun, because if you take the last T of toit, T-O-I, toit means you. Sounds exactly the same. So it can also echo that thought, that she's alone, she's without another she might relate to. And the English word vagabond is interesting, and I'll say a little bit more about that. The idea of a vagrant is someone who has nowhere to live, nowhere to stay, and probably sleeping rough all the time. That's the image that kind of haunts you and haunts the film, and it's one we'll come back to at the end. And you see her painfully twisted body, twisted from the freezing temperatures in the south of France at this time of year. So the project is one then for the documentary maker of reconstructing a life from witness reports. And Agnès Varda's 1985 film then, called Sans toit ni loi, presents itself as a documentary, as explained at the end of the opening sequence. So the remainder of the film provides a reconstruction of Mona, the young woman's experience, from the time she goes to the Languedoc area of the southwest France. And this is cross-cut seamlessly with brief excerpts from the interviews the documentary maker has gathered from those who encountered her. These witness reports are supposedly the source of the story she reconstructs. But much of the work of the film is achieved through more cinematic means, especially in the scenes of the landscape in winter, of ploughed fields, lines of vines, dilapidated buildings, rusty railings, rusting machinery, animals, trees, the sea. In fact, Mona emerges from the sea, itself a trope in filmmaking, as for example in Ursula Andress emerging from the sea, as Sean Connery, James Bond, waits for her. And what we find then is in these cinematic, very visual means is alternations of or contestations between what Deleuze and Guattari call the striated and the smooth. The striated is the lines of those steps going up there, or possibly the lines of seats, or the lines on a road, which you see. And the lines of the vines as they stretch across the landscape, of the furrows which have been dug for those vines to be planted in. And the smooth space is the space of the sea, the space that's not lineated in that way, not the space of the diagram. So there's a constant interplay between these, an attempt perhaps in the film to find an appropriate tension between these apparent opposites, these different kinds. And there is pain in the taut strings in the music of the soundtrack, which I think is more or less the only music you hear throughout the film. So we see her walking and walking, always walking, across this dry but cold landscape. And there are echoes of Thoreau here, referring to walking itself, ecology, and accounting. Because Walden is a book of accounting, raising questions of expenditure and waste, but also of what it is to give an account of oneself. Thoreau spent hours literally walking in the woods, and the experiment in living, that is the book Walden, is a seeking after a better ecology. And his essay, Walking, contemplates a kind of walking that he identifies as sauntering or just wandering. Saunter is an interesting word. It connects with the sans terre in French. In medieval times then, the pilgrims that wandered across the land trying to go to the Holy Land were referred as sans-terreurs, people who were wandering with that purpose and had no land of their own. And so his thoughts touch on the distinction, sometimes somewhat blurred, between the medieval Holy Landers on their pilgrimage and vagrants or vagabonds. So what I'm imagining here then is that in those times, there were some people walking who were indeed en route to the Holy Land, but there would be many others who were walking just with some vague sense of a Holy Land, wandering. They're on the road. They dropped out, in a sense. And he wants to blur those boundaries, also to suggest perhaps people who were homeless had nowhere to go and who kind of legitimated themselves by calling themselves pilgrims at that time. And partly what we're concerned with then through these witness reports is the circumstances of Mona's life. How else would we piece it together? What questions is she asked? Well, what about your family? Where do you stay? Are you working? Is it safe? What did you do before? And those words again seem to echo something in Thoreau, because he's writing in the first person in his supposed journal of this time he spends in the woods at Walden Pond. And Thoreau writes, "Some have asked what I got to eat, if I did not feel lonesome, if I was not afraid, and the like. Others have been curious to learn what proportion of my income I devoted to charitable purposes, and some, who have large families, how many children I maintained." But Thoreau's book is also an indictment of those asking the questions and of the poverty of the lives they are leading. There's a strong sense of the self-satisfaction of these people who are asking the questions. But I do want to emphasize that it's important that the narration of the film is by this auteur figure, casting Mona as the object for speculation. It's a different position from which we are considering things here. Let's consider some of the people who do provide witness accounts, who have seen Mona, and tell the director. Let's imagine what they found when they saw Mona, what happened when they saw her. I'm only going to give you 2 or 3 here. So there's one guy who works in a petrol station, and he says, when she showed up, she had a big backpack. She was looking for work. I gave her a car to wash, 30 francs. Got her hands clean, at least. I would have let her pump petrol, but I didn't trust her. Female drifters, or alike, just looking for men. And then there is Yolande, who comes into the story at various points. She's a kind of housekeeper and a rather sad figure, maltreated by her very inattentive boyfriend. And she romanticizes Mona's life and wishes she could be like her in many ways. But then I want to take you on to one of the 3 or 4 characters, where there seems to be a greater hope for some progress in Mona's situation. And this is Asuna, who is a Tunisian worker in the vineyards. And he's actually working in a vineyard with a load of Moroccan workers as well. And she approaches him, she wants water, she wants a bit of help, and he offers her shelter. He offers her shelter and food, fundamental Islamic values. He displays them. He's not seeking after anything out of her. And in fact, this is Asuna. In fact, he also says to her that he gets paid a certain amount for doing a field of vines, that is pruning them or trimming them, whatever you do to them. And if she likes, she can help him. He'll teach her what to do. She can help him, and then they'll share some of that money. And so you see him at various points, guiding her through what to do, showing her, guiding her hands, and so on. Nothing exploitative here. And then also he gives her food. She's living in the same house. He makes food. They eat it together. It's an interesting scene because she starts by sitting next to him. That's the way the table's laid out. And she says, do you usually eat snack bar style? And then of her own accord, she takes the chair and moves to the position so that she's at right angles to him and can talk directly to him. They have a real, genuine conversation. And then in the course of the conversation, she recounts something that someone else had said about her. She tells him about the foreman's wife, who had told her that vine keeping isn't a woman's job. She also told me that her daughter works in an underpants factory. And there is the foreman and his wife sitting together in parallel, watching, I suppose, TV. And he says to her, it's odd to see a girl camp out in winter, but times are changing. Look at Florence. She's worse than boys, wants to ride motorbikes all the time. Wait, when she meets a nice boy, it'll all be okay. She mustn't wind up like that camper, he says. So you see the tone of judgment, complacency, wanting to keep things the same, and so on. And things actually don't go well because the Moroccan workers will not tolerate her staying in the house. It's no great surprise to us, I guess, but they will not tolerate it. And she is angry with Asuna because he's not stood up to them better or enabled her to stay, at least. And so we see her, if you like, alone in that landscape. I want to draw attention to the lines going away from her or coming towards her, but also to that scarf around her neck, which in fact he gave her because she was cold. It's his scarf. And it's touching that she's wearing that scarf, snaked round her neck. And in the light of what's just happened, it's difficult not to see just a trace of the religious here and of the idea of the woman as connected with the snake and the reason that she has to leave the vineyard, leave the garden, which she would otherwise have worked in. I don't want to decode the film in terms of these connections, but to my mind, they stray across your mind. They're there as part of the landscape that the film generates. And now I'd like to just play a sequence of this to you. This is about 5 minutes. She comes across or approaches a place where there's a man who's with his wife, and they're rearing goats and making goat's cheese. This is the life that they've tried to create for themselves. So we're going to watch about 5 minutes now.
Très facilement. Donc ce soir peut-être.
Même dans la salle.
Il y en a combien? Une bonne centaine. Je ne compte pas exactement. Tu les connais toutes, chacune? À peu près, la moitié des noms. Je fais ça.
Bonjour. Bien dormi? C'est bien. Tu sais, la route, je connais, hein.
T'as fait la route, toi?
Donc on était transhumants. 6 mois à la montagne, 6 mois on descendait dans le pays.
Ouais, mais avec une femme et un troupeau, c'est autre chose. C'est plus un déménagement.
C'est pas le même type de route que ce que tu as fait quand même. Chacun vivre ses envies, hein. Puis voilà. Tu te balades seul? Tu souffres pas trop de la solitude?
Seul, c'est bien.
J'ai passé des nouvelles seul. C'est intéressant, les voyages se frais. Moi j'étais seul.
Mais quand il fait froid, c'est bien. Il n'y a pas trop de monde sur les routes. On trouve du stock plus facilement.
Du temps de la gentillesse de l'homme qui te prend pas. Puis voilà, s'il te prend, tant mieux. Et s'il t'ennuie pas, encore mieux.
Je m'en fous, je bouge.
Peut-être que tu es plus libre que moi. Tant mieux pour toi. choisis un milieu. Un moyen terme entre la solitude et la liberté.
Moi, on m'a emmerdé pas mal de temps. Maintenant, c'est fini.
Toi, c'est la liberté totale, tu choisis, mais tu as la solitude totale. Il y a un moment où, si on continue, je pense, on se détruit. On va à la destruction. Et si on veut vivre, on arrête. D'ailleurs, tous les amis qui ont fait la route et qui ont continué, ils sont morts. Ils sont devenus des locs, alcooliques, drogués. En général. Parce que la solitude les a bouffés complètement.
Tu vas l'emmener à l'école quand même. Il aurait bien fait dire. C'est trop longtemps qu'il a couché. Il apprendra à lire, à écrire. Il a une maîtrise de philo. T'as une maîtrise de philo? Donc qu'est-ce que tu fais là alors?
Toi, Claire.
C'est ce que je voudrais aussi. Avoir un petit bout de terre en moi. Cultiver des patates. Ah,
Bon, alors la terre, ça rigole pas. Hein. Il faut être là quand il faut, au moment où il faut. Si tu veux un champ de patates, je te propose ça. Voilà, toute cette terre déciperée jusqu'au fruitier. Voilà. Donc, pas mal d'espace. Tu peux mettre de patates.
je n'y arriverai pas.
De toute façon, je vais te donner un coup de main. Hein. Je te laboure la terre, je te verse, et ensuite tu poses tes plants. Voilà. J'ai mis un matelas, il y a un poêle, très bien. Tu pourras vendre les fromages s'il y a de monde. Puis nous aussi, on sera mieux comme ça chez nous, on sera tranquille. Tu sais monter?
C'est mieux comme ça. Pour 3 plus le troupeau, ça fait beaucoup de monde. J'ai pas l'habitude.
Okay, so what's going on? But you see her. You see her settling in, if that's the word, into the caravan that's been provided for her. A short while later, you see her dozing in the caravan, but also reading a book. And he comes to the door, and he's not very pleased with her. So I'd just like to skip a bit and then go on to this bit I've referred to now. Stop jumping.
Voilà, dors! Je te dis, ça va pas? Tu dors tout le temps? Nous, on bosse tout le temps. Ça va pas, c'est pas juste. Puis c'est sale. Il y a des mégots partout, c'est brûlé. Ah.
Oh, il n'y a pas de quoi en faire un fromage.
Oh, tu dis n'importe quoi pour me faire chier. Sors, on s'explique.
Mais qu'est-ce qu'il y a? Qu'est-ce que tu veux?
C'est toi qui veux rien. On t'a donné un bout de terre, t'en as rien fait. T'as rien à la tête.
Pourquoi? Faut absolument avoir quelque chose? Faut être absolument berger comme toi? T'as pas que ta façon d'être marginal.
Ton marginal, c'est out. Ça n'existe pas.
Okay, so a really interesting thing about this scene you just seen is that the people who are talking to her, the actress Sandrine Bonner, who's playing the part, the people you're seeing are people who are really living these lives. So he is a philosophy major. He did come away from his life as a teacher, and he has decided to spend his life rearing goats and selling goat's cheese and so on. So these are real people, so it's quite an extraordinary mix, as it were, of the documentary, the fake documentary, and the fictional film. And he says that you don't exist. What we know now is that she did do some training when she was at school and learnt to be a shorthand typist, somebody who probably worked in a typing pool, and that was her main life. She doesn't seem very much like that. We find traces in her behaviour of reading the book and of a liking for language, as you'll see a little later on, and that suggests something else to her. But for his part, he was the dropout. He speaks sympathetically of her situation and his friends, but there's something controlling about his behaviour. He is generous. He said, you can use this field for your potatoes. I'll help you. But there's something controlling, patronising, demeaning about the way he speaks to her, and even slightly prurient at times, I think, as well, so as if he's gawping at her way of living on the road. Let me move on. So a second person where there seems to be a chance, she's been sung out from that place. The second person is Madame Landier, and she just picks her up in the car, and they get chatting. They get on very well. Madame Landier is actually a professor of dendrology, tree surgery, tree health, and so on, in the local university. And they spend a lot of time together. She says that actually Mona has taken root in her car. And at one point, Madame Landier is in some kind of celebration at a conference, and there's champagne around and lots of food. And she brings out a plate and sits in the car chatting happily to Mona while they drink champagne out of the bottle. But her specialism, Madame Landier, or main concern now, is a research project on parasites in trees, in the plane trees that stretch across the southern parts of France. And that brings in, of course, the suggestion of what a parasite is. And you can think of two kinds of parasite, or two ways in which that word is used. One is to do with biological parasites of the kind you see in the images, and the other is to do with people as parasites. Because, of course, one way to see Mona's condition is that she's a parasite on society. She's not doing anything for society, which thought also invokes the question of how many of those who are criticising her are also parasites in some way or other as well. But in French, there's a third meaning also, that the word is used for static electricity or interference on the line, white noise perhaps. And that also is relevant to what happens next, because there's a strange scene in which Madame Landier has an electric shock, literally an electric shock. She's touching two things in the bathroom, hands are wet. By this time, however, she has also given up her relationship with Mona. Though they were getting on very well, although Madame Landier was fascinated by her, and they liked each other, it's very warm at times, here you see her dropping off Mona for the last time on the pretext that she is going to Paris for a few days. That's the end of the ride they're going to have. And you notice that Mona is now sitting in the back, and Mona's puzzled by the way she's been put in the back. So with the electric shock, there she is recovering from it with a colleague. And she says the following: I almost died from the shock, electrocuted. A blinding light. It's true what they say. I saw moments of my life flash by. Images. It took ages. Oh, it's bizarre. The hitchhiker I picked up. She kept coming back like a kind of reproach. And in fact, she now refers to the fact that she had left Mona by the side of the woods. What she doesn't know is that there emerged a man from the woods and Mona was raped then. But she's worried because of the dangers in the woods, and she says to a colleague, you can't leave her there, the woods aren't safe, you must go and find her. Of course, nothing happens. So Mona's lost that possibility of a better kind of life, or at least some help in the way she was living, and she's living in a worse and worse state. Here we are seeing her not coming from the sea, but beginning to merge with the land itself. You see the colour on her face, and the colours she's wearing, the mud on her clothes. And there she is, cold, shivering in a polytunnel, so many polytunnels in this landscape of France to force this food that we all like to eat around the year. clutching her blanket around her. And she stumbles into a town. She's asking the way to buy some bread. She stumbles into a town, and suddenly she notices that people are running away from the centre of the town. She doesn't know why, but then these people, men, dressed in rough clothes, covered in wine or the leftovers when wine is produced, and wearing foliage on their heads. Frightening figures come and chase her, grab her, and so on. And she is frightened because she has no idea what's going on. Here she is inside a phone box being more or less attacked from outside. So this is some kind of wine festival, wine revelry, which is perhaps being you're seeing it not in its authentic original state, one can imagine, but in some sort of vandalized replay that's going on, a bit of a laugh amongst young people working there. There they are sitting in a bath, two of them, laughing as they cover themselves in mud and wine. And there finally, when she escapes, you see her walking away. And she's in a pretty desperate state now. She's wet, she's cold, she's filthy dirty, she stinks. And incidentally, Sandrine Bonnaire didn't wash or change clothes for 2 months when she was making the film. So what kind of wine festival is that? And what I want you to see here also is the colours that dominate those 4 images, with the pervasive colour of the wine or the detritus from what's made, the making of the wine, and then also that slight variation as your eye goes down to her feet, the insides of her zipped boots, which have this reddish lining. So we've got the mauve shading into blood, and I was reminded earlier on when we looked at Chantal's picture, one of those abstract pictures with similar colours, but many more colours in that picture. And so I want actually to talk a little bit about blood and its connection with wine, where again, it's difficult to hold back some kind of religious suggestion, isn't it? The blood of Christ made wine. And so thinking about wine then, I'd like also to think about the sense of belonging, the patrilineal line, the line that's holding those families together, the confident position from which they're criticising her, and of course in the background those fascist themes that have been talked about already today. So let's imagine then a bloodline that would be ideal from this patrilinear, perhaps monarchical kind of a point of view. In an idealized patrilineal dynasty then, the bloodline passes from father to firstborn son. So there's the first son. We're going to go backwards in time now. 2 parents there, 4, 8, 16, 32. And if you go on, 64, and it goes up to, go back 10 generations, about 300 years, and there would be 1,024 grandparents. We all have 1,024 grandparents. Go back 300 years. But of course, it's only one that's really noticed, only one that people come back to, and that's the one in blue, because that's the line of the name, isn't it? That's the name being passed down. That's the one that people, at least traditionally, at least in Western cultures, seem to take most seriously as the line of inheritance. The lineage is marked by the continuity of the name, inscribed in various forms. If it's not inscribed, it probably won't be remembered in the same way. And the continuity of the mark sustains an idea of essence, of essential qualities, true blood, true meaning. But this is to think down the lines of a vertical axis, ignoring the lateral connections. So let's look at another bloodline. Back to Mona. And perhaps remarkably, one of the things she does is to give blood. This is a mobile blood collection, blood transfusion service. And the guy in the background is just sitting there with his line in his arm. And he's chatting a bit to her. And he says to her, "Clench your fist. It makes the blood flow better." And she says, "I'm in no hurry." So Mona's giving of blood constitutes a bloodline of a more literal and lateral kind. She is literally giving blood to other people of her same group. It is to those with whom she has something in common, not a symbolic lineage, but a blood group. And that made me want to think about reproduction and dissemination, the scattering of seed in its most simple form. So reproduction might suggest the production of the same in biological inheritance and in the transfer of meaning in communication, where the meaning is transferred without loss, without alteration. You say your words, the person directly understands you. But dissemination, as I've already hinted, can suggest something different. And apart from the scattering that I referred to, it can be also understood with this negative prefix as a non-semination, not a fathering, as it were, but rather just this scattering of the seed. It's a different pattern, a different axis, if you like. And Peggy Kamoff writes that as a descriptive name for the transferential movement of meaning, dissemination explicitly detaches that process from the transmission of a father's seed, which would be produced only by sons. Indeed, and I tried to hold Derrida back until later in the story, but he's crept in already. Indeed, as Derrida has used it, it makes detachment from the original seed of meaning, or from the kernel of an original intention to mean, the condition of the transfer. So we're talking about patterns of inheritance, patterns of relationship, but also about the language we use and the very nature of our thought, derivative as it is overwhelmingly from language. And I would like now to just trace two lines of criticism of philosophy that I think are relevant to what we're concerned with here about the nature of language, the nature of meaning, and the nature of sexual and gender difference. So the first line is actually one that's been developed in analytical philosophy, so-called, and this is one developed by Genevieve Lloyd, and she was writing this around about the same time that Agnes Varda was developing this film. And she wrote an article and then a book in 1983, I think, called The Man of Reason, or Man of Reason. And at the opening of the article, she explains, by the man of reason, I mean the ideal of rationality associated with the rationalist philosophers of the 17th century. And secondly, something more nebulous, the residue of that ideal in our contemporary consciousness, our inheritance from 17th century rationalism. This is, I think, a substantial component in what reason has come to be. But it's not, of course, the only component. But it is one which does highlight, I think, some aspects of reason which are of considerable relevance to philosophical aspects of feminism. The main feature of the man of reason, which I'm concerned to bring into focus, is his maleness. More is involved here than the supposedly neutral sense of man to include women. We are all familiar with the fact that linguistic usage commonly fails to recognize that humanity comprises two sexes. But there is something deeper to the maleness of the man of reason, something more deeply ingrained in consciousness. He is consciousness. When the man of reason is extolled, philosophers are not talking about idealizations of human beings, they're talking about ideals of manhood. And I'm sure she intends that to apply well beyond the bounds of philosophy, something to do with the way we've come to think of reason. So the other strand I'm going to pull out does come out more obviously, and this does relate specifically to Derrida and to his critique of Heidegger's conception of Dasein. What's Dasein? Heidegger's project is to understand the essence of human being, but he wants to avoid that word because the word human being is so steeped in associations and problems, precisely those ones from the 17th century, which he wants to overcome. He wants to see beyond them. So the design, which means being there, or their being, Dasein is depicted in that novel as neuter. There's no mention of maleness or femaleness. It's depicted as neuter. That Dasein sees, Dasein hears, Dasein makes things, knocks nails into wood, and so on. But no mention of gender or sexuality beyond that, or sex beyond that. Subsequently, Heidegger, this was in a lecture course the following year, 1928, just after Sein und Zeit was published, and he did having thought about this, or having been pressed on the problem, he did suggest that sexual difference emerged in two stages. First, as the tranquil relationship of brother and sister, knowing they're different but existing in a kind of harmony with one another. And secondly, as a later dissension, perhaps to be overcome in the destiny of a restored harmony. He doesn't spell it out as quickly as that, but clearly he thinks this dissension is overcome if Dasein pursues its destiny, which of course is to be found in belonging to the community and to the people from which it has come. Heidegger says very little about sex. But this factor can only be excluded on the basis of a categorization or inscription that has already taken place. And it's as if this precondition, that there are two sexes, but two sexes of what, is something we cannot get at. So the words at issue here, sex, gender, are significant because of the range of meanings they gather. Sexual difference, sexual relations, relations between the sexes, sexual desire, and so on. And also the complications of translation. Because gender has no equivalent exactly in French or German. Instead, the terms used extend into chains of connection, which Derrida brings into focus with his works under the title Geschlecht. He wrote 4 essays under that title, and I'm drawing loosely from them. And Geschlecht in German could also mean genre, family, stock, race, lineage, generation. And the French word genre actually translates most commonly as genre. So it unsteadies so much of the talk, so much of the earnest theorization there is about sex and gender that goes on in English. So let me pursue this a bit further then, and I didn't mean all these pictures to show up straight away, but I just want to remind you that Mona was a shorthand typist, believe it or not. So these connections then, Geschlecht, sex, race, nation, the human, and the paragraphs are out of order, but the word has connotations of typing, of type, of a mark, a stamp, a strike or blow. And there's a medieval English word, slag, which means still being used, to refuse matter from smelting. So it's the breaking down of, it's the way you deal with what's left over once the coal has been extracted. Connections with Middle Low German, Slager, splinter, flying off when metal is struck, and so on. Slagen in German, strike, slay. And then also in contemporary English, slag heap, where that pile of stuff that's not quite coal is, but also as the slang word for a woman of some degree of sexual looseness. That would be the kind of implication. It's a very offensive word. Well, yeah, that is the next slide. So what's this then? So I've been trying to say that Dasein comes over as neuter, right? It's just taken for granted how Dasein is. No menstruation, no babies. So Dasein is neuter, but because of those factors I've mentioned, also surreptitiously it seems actually male all the time. And then look at the robots that are being created now. What are they? Any robots who are menstruating, do you think? I doubt it very much, or whatever sex robots there may be. So I want to come back then to these words, sex, biology, reproduction, relations, desire, and just say a little bit to bring things to a close here. I said earlier on that it's as if this precondition, that there are two sexes, that the way Heidegger kind of calmly describes it, is something we cannot get at. There's no doubt that you can get at it biologically. You know, there's not really much doubt about being able to analyze things like that. But if we now try to talk about it in that same grown-up scientific style, it slips away from us, just as the discreteness of philosophers, of both persuasions, analytic and continental, secretes further layers of complication. So their discreteness, the analytical thinking it's not really something we should be concerned with, and Heidegger kind of quietly avoiding it as not being the essence of what the human being is, by secreting it, they've also actually added to the mystery or the uncertainty that surrounds this. Heidegger writing at the same time as Freud. Analytical philosophy taking this stance at the same time as Freud's work has had so much influence. Kind of repression goes on then. And it is as if the masculine, still intact, is presupposed. The male has put its stamp on philosophy and on Dasein. So the film suggests that we're too quick to pass judgment and too quick to find labels or categories in our naming of things. This tendency to compartmentalize and arrest what's in fact dynamic and changing and always open to revision is itself a product of the containment or arresting or repression of sexual difference. So think also, as I've indicated, as the difficulties of language and translation. Incidentally, the film dwells on questions of language at certain points. Mona likes language, and when she's left in a car for some time, Madame Landier says, "Won't you be bored?" And she says, "No, I'll practice my irregular English verbs. Drink, drank, drunk, sink, sank, sunk, wink, winked, winked." So she does that, waiting then. And she also likes puns. And at various points she laughs about puns or makes puns herself. And actually Sojin drew my attention to the fact that when she's in a bad state, taking drugs and getting drunk with people in a railway station, and an awful man tries to get her to make money for him, and he says, wouldn't you like to pose? And she says, "I am pausing." Not posing, but pausing. And that says quite a lot about her life. So difficulties of language and translation are ongoing sources of resistance to this categorizing and containment. And it's highly important for our education and politics that the problems of translation are acknowledged and sustained. Not accepting this leads to a kind of violence, the overconfidence of wanting to get everything straight, everything proper, in a state of propriety and cleanness, because the French brings together that notion of propre, in property, propriety, a sense of cleanness, of tidiness, of purity. So, tending the vineyard, we saw Asuna teaching Mona what to do to prune the vine. Susan Bryson speaks of the new growth of grass following one or more mowings. And the visual contrast established in the film suggests the human responsibility to sustain a good ecology. Again, almost with biblical echoes, I think. There are hints here of this religious symbolism, as I've suggested, and of violence against women as part of our continuing pathology. In the opening sequence that you saw, the camera zoomed in across this field of furrows of ploughed earth, brown earth, and the director has talked about the striking factor of that rather striking hill with the two cypress trees on the top. And I can't now look at that hill without thinking of the three trees, the three crosses, and the crucifixion as well. It's only a thought that strays in the mind, but somehow I think it's there. Okay, so violence against women as part of our continuing pathology. So the violence, I think, extends in the kinds of lives that girls, at that time at least, were taught to live, working as a shorthand typist, pressing keys on a keyboard, the hitting of the key, perhaps a mechanical typewriter where the force depends upon the force of the finger, perhaps an electric typewriter where it's clatter, 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 very harsh straight away. We have better keyboards now. But I wanted to leave you with this image, this powerful image of this twisted shape of her body, but then juxtaposed against that one, which we didn't linger on, but which you saw in that opening sequence. And it's surely an extraordinary picture because the man's standing in the way, isn't he? The policeman is standing in the way. You can't see the person he's talking to. We're very conscious somehow of his position in relation to us. And where are we? Well, we're standing with the same orientation straight behind him. We're looking in the same direction behind his back. It aligns his position with ours. It turns us into one of those people who are investigating the case, trying to categorize it. What's wrong with her? Do you think she's got ADHD? That might be the answer. We'd have an explanation then. Can you see how we're put in this position of being like those witnesses who complacently go back to our own lives and assumptions and settled views and don't get the suffering that we've been seeing? Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.